Dear friends, I'm very glad to see you. Now I'll begin to speak about my favorite theme, about my main scientific interest in archaeology. This is Crimean natives. And now I will speak about Crimean natives at the beginning of Iron Age. I will speak about sites and material culture. This is a whole very big, very big theme, but I'll try to speak about it briefly. The Greek colonization in Crimea corresponds to the beginning of the Iron Age in North Pontic areas. The study of the sites of the Crimean population before and during colonization got started from the modern era, when the Crimea became interesting to such great empires as the Ottoman, Russian, and Napoleonic France. The first descriptions of Crimean antiquities relate more to those sites that were only recently abandoned by their inhabitants. They can be found together with local ethnography in the travel notes or negotiators and earlier times travelers. Scientists who professionally described antiquities and understood the text of ancient authors appeared in Crimea from the end of the 18th century. The first were Simon Pallas, a German scholar who worked at the Russian court of Catherine II, and Dubois de Montpellier, who is associated with the interests of Napoleonic France. Actually, they were the first to describe burial structures in the form of stone schist, which they connected with the local inhabitants mentioned by the ancient authors. The further events led to the siege of the Crimea by the Russian Empire, and accordingly, the formation of the powerful layer of Russian historiography at the basis of research into Crimean antiquities. After all, at the beginning of the 20th century, classical archaeologists equated burial sites of stone schist with the Tauri of writing sources, which they considered to be the local population of Crimea. In the first decades of the 20th century, prehistoric archaeology began to actively develop in the Crimea, as a result of which Bonch-Osmolovsky identified an archaeological culture named after the site of the first find, Kyzyl-Koba, determined it belonged to the local population of the late Bronze and early Iron Age, and separated it from other finds of the Stone Age. Then Bonch-Osmolovsky noted in one on his nonfiction that looking at these material remains, the mention of wild troglodyte Tauri involuntarily comes to mind. Further events in Soviet science led to large-scale repressions, executions, deportations, scientists of concentration camps in Siberia, and the majority of Crimean researchers fell under these repressions. They were replaced by others, mainly cultural education workers, who did not really understand the intricacies of scientific research. In this way, the troglodyte Tauri mentioned in the work by Bonch-Osmolovsky becomes the population of the Kyzyl-Koba archaeological culture. In the works, in papers by Belovst, Zheletsky, Tumenev, and other Soviet archaeologists. Kolotofin was the first who tried to separate these two concepts. He singled out the so-called late Bronze Age sites from the general array, Then he continued to consider the rest of the sites of Kizil-Koba and belong them to Tauri. Later, this is a map by Kolotuhin. The sites, the Taurian sites didn't separate from the late bronze sites in this map, but here is a massive of sites which he analyzed. Then he continued to consider the rest of sites of Kyiv-Koba and belong them to Tauri. Later, we approached this issue from another angle. We analyzed ancient texts from the point of view of their traditionality and belonging to ancient mythology and fragments of references to local ethnography. In the end, we confirmed Tolstoy's concept of the traditionality of the legend of Iphigenia in written sources about Taurica, and in addition, we isolated ethnographic information about the local population, which could have reached logographers from the stories of sailors and merchants. Our second step was the analysis of material culture. For this purpose, we singled out the most informative ones from the entire array of sites, multi-layered ones with fixed stratigraphy, which becomes the basis for the selection of synchronous complexes, and other that were analyzed according to the schema created on the basis of the analysis of multi-layered sites. At the end, a classification of ceramics based on more than 70 formal features was formed, which provides small groups, species of ceramic vessels. Species were grouped into rows and types of ceramics were formed. There is handmade pottery. This is cooking pottery. Here is fineware, jugs, bowls, and basins. So here is the types. This is rows of vessels. Species were grouped into rows and types of ceramics are formed. At the same time, the species is a narrow chronological category. This is a species. Characterized by a separate ornamental motif and style with other characteristics that can be attributed to other types. Like in the synchronous types, synchronous species. The type may include different motifs and styles of ornament in the vessel, but the constant in each type is the share of the vessel, shape of the vessel. Sorry. The duration of types in time formed periodization in culture. The remaining signs of culture, both artifacts and processes, such as the economic model and its components, infrastructure, house construction, planning, crafts, etc., confirmed the correctness of the allocation of periods since their dynamics consider with periodization explaining its phenomenon. Two early periods have been defined as pre-Taurian, the material culture of which belongs to an unknown ethnic groups. Here is in these two maps. It was formed from migrants from the Balkan Carpathia, local tribes of the Belozerka culture of the lower Dnieper, and the so-called late Bronze Age of Crimea relicts of the Belozerka culture at the end of the 12th, 10th centuries BC. It is also worth noting that the culture of lower Dnieper and Crimea in the 12th, 10th centuries BC is identical and is most likely one of the local variants of the Belozerka culture. These tribes lost their integrity in the middle of the 8th century BC. From this time on, one could talk about the formation of a new ethnos or tribes, which is represented by the material culture of the Taurian period. This is two maps. It is likely that the Greeks came into contact with this population when they founded their colonies in Taurica. Its ethnic features disappear in the second half of the 4th, 3rd centuries BC. In the future, the material culture of the local population is the basis for the formation of the Late Scythian material complex. And these were the main conclusions of our dissertation research, on the basis of which all subsequent work, both field and laboratory, was carried out. This is a periodization of Kizil-Koba culture with synchronization with neighbors, with another cultures of northern Black Sea areas, Caucasus and Balkans. So I turn to the main result of the recent research. Despite their rather compact location on the coast, different parts of the Pontic region sometimes have completely different histories and cultures. This is due to the fact that it is a frontier of several different civilizations in terms of origin, worldview, religion, and social organization. Some Black Sea provinces are characterized by the synchronous or sequential adaptive activity of several of them at once. One of these regions is Crimea, sometimes at the beginning of the Iron Age, which we define in this region as the 9th century BC. Historical processes were characterized by the same conditions as during the final Bronze Age in the entire northern Black Sea and eastern Mediterranean. The starting point of which is probably the revival in the Balkans, which led to the events known like the Trojan War. Crimea was inhabited by tribes that advanced to the peninsula from the area of the Gava cultures. This is Balkan area, where they founded a number of fortified settlements. Subsequently, after a century, we record active manual contacts between the inhabitants of these seaside settlements and the population, which left sites of the Belozerka culture of the Lower Dnieper region and the so-called Late Bronze Age culture in Crimea, which, as can be seen from the analysis of their material culture, are a single cultural massive. One of the largest seaside fortified settlement is Ujibash. Here it is. This is near the Sevastopol. Began to master the newest technology of obtaining iron from local ore. At this time, many new settlements appeared in the foothills of Crimea, characterized by identical features in material culture. The population occupied all the foothills. Here is a old Taurian period, a few sites, and here is a younger pre-Taurian period, twice more sites. In archaeology, these sites are the Kyzyl-Koba culture. The entire array of sites from their appearance to the end of their existence in the middle of the 8th century BC is divided into two periods. So the older pre-Taurian periods from the 12th to the 10th centuries BC. This is a time of emergence of settlements with a new economy and the construction, here it is, construction of the local material complex, and the younger pre-Taurian period, here it is, from the 9th to the middle of the 8th centuries BC. This is the time of beginning of the application of iron production technology and the use of iron began of use of iron object. This is a time of greatest well-being of local culture and economic development when a new metallurgical province arose based on reminiscence of Hallstatt traditions. The selection of personalization of crafts, the predominance of quality and aesthetics over quantity in material production, the development of agronomy as the beginning of the allocation of personal share and probably living space, which adapted to the production of depositable local surface hematite ores, the remains of which are still found in limestones along the Crimean foothills. The next historical period in Crimea began in the line of fires. Here is a workshop of Uchbash. This is a fragment of iron from the complex of this workshop. And this is a map of Chernogorovka and Novocherkasska type artifacts, which was found in the sites of Northern Black Sea region with analogies of Uchbash complexes here. With the line of fires in the richest fortified settlements and hill forts of the Northern Black Sea region, which is connected by the material complex brought with the nomads who left Novocherkasska antiquities of the early Scythian culture. Here is the line. Here it was, this is the Volga region, and here is a line of fire for Balkan and Balkans region and for Danube region. One can argue about their name, Cimmerians or early Scythians, but in fact, from the destruction they caused, a new era began in the region and the processes of Scythian period began. And so this line of fire comes to the Crimea, and some of sites stops their existence. It should be noted that the local population had contacts with the nomadic world before, and they were not always peaceful. It is assumed that the Uchbash settlement burned down for the first time as a result of the Chernogorovka type, here is nomad attack. But unlike the time of the attack of Novocherkasska type tribes in the middle of the 8th century BC, events of the 10th, 9th century BC here did not lead to the death of the settlement and the change in its economic arrangement. On the contrary, from this time, it can be assumed that the local tribes began to master the land routes of communication together with the sea routes that they used before. It is likely that this interaction led to the emergence of one of the earliest centers of iron metallurgy in the Uchbash settlement. Starting from the middle of the 8th century BC, local culture and economy began to decline. The demographic consists of the population of the foothills is changing significantly. The remains of local tribes are joined by groups of people from Lower Don, Kuban. Here is the maps. This is maps of beginning of Taurian period. The North Caucasus and even from Middle Transnistria, as can be seen from the characteristic features of these regions in the ornamentation of ceramics. The previously empty steppe Crimea is gradually adopted by Scythians, and finally, here it is, this is a 6-4 centuries BC Scythian cemeteries, and this is the same Scythian cemeteries, burial mounds, and ground cemeteries, and or barbarian population, and the same cemeteries with stelia, with stone stelia, also with a Hellenistic type of stelia. So finally, from the 7th, 6th centuries BC, the entire Crimean Sea coast is in the sphere of interest of Greek sailors, especially the deep bays that are convenient for land and port. And it was in sphere places that the Greek founded their first settlements. Here it is. And this area is not in interest of local population. That time local population, as we see in this and in this map. The sharing of the local population at the time of Greek colonization was generally carried out by identifying archaeological sites with data from narrative sources. First of all, writing sources were taken as a basis. It should be noted that there are really few that such as that date back to the time of colonization and the early stages of the existence of Greek colonies. There are only a few of them that precede Herodotus stories, and none of them mention Taurians. There are no Taurians either in the list of peoples east to the Hellespont or in Homer's hymns. Herodotus, who gives several different testimonies about them, can be considered the first mention of the Tauri. In addition to the fact that they worship the bloodthirsty goddess Parthenos, we also find a description of the custom of displaying the heads of enemies and accommodating them above the roofs near the chimneys, which is also known to us from later ethnographic description of the primitive people. So is mention of cattle breeding, of the Tauri kings who were allied with the Scythians. If the mythological stories about Iphigenia is discarded, then there will be descriptions that are quite understandable from the point of view of ethnography. In general, they are also confirmed by archaeological material. The society, judging by their type of economy, was primitive. Is one of the burial grounds near Chersonesos. Skulls were found stacked in the pale in the opposite corner from the heads of the buried dead, which in general confirms the cult of skulls among the tribes of the Kyzyl-Koba culture of the Taurian period, and in the end, the forming of three main groups of culture. The western one in the basin of the Chornaya River, the central one in the middle course of the Salgir, and the eastern one between Zuya and Meskumia in the upper reaches. Here is, this is the Chornaya River basin, the first group. This is the second group of Zuya and of Salgir, and another one here. Here it is not showed in this map, but this is a place which they occupy. This is a place of their occupation. Here is it. In the Taurian period, all three groups existed, which suggests the existence of three tribal associations. So the story about the Tauri kings is also historically determined. There is no evidence that the colonists' first contacts with the local population were hostile. Most likely just the opposite. Starting from the 5th century BC, ancient imports are recorded in the burial grounds of local tribes, most often fragments of amphorae in commemorations, as well as the necklace. Here is this is a place. This is a pottery, Kizil-Koba pottery from Kirkinetida complexes, from the buildings of Kirkinetida, dated from the 5th to the from the end of 6th to the 4th centuries BC, and the same Kizil-Koba pottery from the Inkerman Valley sites near Chersonesus Hora. And here is a pottery from the Kyzyl-Koba sites on northern western Crimea from the excavation of Dashevska. And here is from Heraclean Peninsula near Chersonesus from the excavation of Savela. And this is 4th century BC, and this is 4th century BC. And here is a typical Taurian cemetery, Urkusta cemetery in Baydar Valley of the western group of Kyzyl-Koba tribes. Here is a plan of the cemetery. This is the rows of stone system. And ceramics, handmade ceramics and ancient ceramics in the complexes. Most often there are status burials associated with the head of the clan or tribe. Therefore, the contacts probably took place in the classic phase through the top of the tribes of chiefs. The results of such contacts can also be considered a classic variant of harmful social stratification among local tribes, impoverishment of the original population, and as a result, the destruction of society when ethnic characteristics are completely eliminated, and it is perceived as a different cultural basis. This is probably that happened to the tribes of the Kyzyl-Koba culture of the Taurian period in the second half of the 4th-3rd centuries BC. They dissolved among sedentary Scythians who began to advance deep into the peninsula from the 4th centuries BC. The most interesting processes took place in the north of the Crimean Mountains in the central foothills in this region. In the 4th century BC, in the steppes to the north of the central foothill, one of the Scythian tribes were armed, which had certain differences in material culture. Its main features were the presence of specific Eastern Bosporan ceramics in burials. The same pottery was found in one of the local burial grounds in the north of the Crimean Mountains, which is interpreted as the Kyzyl-Koba culture, the Japallakh. Here it is. The analysis of the material showed that this burial ground belongs to a syncretic population, which probably has a Kyzyl-Koba component, but is closer to the Eastern Bosporus population in terms of burial customs. In general, sites of this type can be considered to the basis of so-called Late Scythian component, which become prevalent in the Crimea in Roman times. And one of them is Kronichki, excavated partly by Leskov, partly by Kropotov. It is published. Here is a Japallakh cemetery, and here is a little about the late Scythian and Scythian Taurians. The Japallakh cemetery is mentioned in the paper by Chris, together with other excavations by Leskov in the Crimea, such as the cemetery of Urkusta. Chris, referring to Vesmitina's definition, come to the conclusion that the excavation by Leskov were of poor quality, and the finds was determined incorrectly, so were not possible to analyze. When esquined with the collection, we came to the conclusion that such a contention is evaluative and based related to Chris' personal attitude towards Leskov. Her remarks on the quality of excavation, recording, and the description of archaeological objects should be taken into consideration in the case of the Japallakh cemetery, but only as regards their insufficient detail. With the missing excavation report, this accusation seems unfair, as a detailed description should be in the report, as can be seen from the Urkusta excavation report, which, unlike the Japallakh excavation report, has been preserved in the archive. In general, the description of the archaeological site in paper is exactly consistent with the archaeological realities, despite the fact that attention to such sites began only a decade ago. The finds are also described correctly, but incompletely. The question of ethnicity of Crimean population after the evanescence of Great Scythia was a subject of scientific interest of many scholars. Do you remember the question of Turkish archaeologists, the last seminar about Great Scythia? This is a big problem, but we have a way to explain it. Olkhovsky topologization cemeteries identified several population groups, classifying them as purely Scythians, purely Taurian, and those who have the features of both. He dated the first two ethnically poorer group to the 7th, 5th centuries BC. The other two include the late Kizil-Koba cemeteries, which are mentioned in this lecture, Urkusta, Druzhny II, etc., and the Scythian or late Scythian burials, both dating from the 4th century BC and existing during Hellenistic time. However, the conclusion about the beginning of marginalization and formation of the Scythian-Taurian population in the 7th century BC is not yet confirmed. The author appeals to Herodotus and his story of the ditch of the blind, from whom came a tribe of descendants of Scythians and slaves. In our opinion, the process of contacts between early Tauri and steppe population of 8th, 7th centuries BC was slightly different, as described in the number of articles. Late Tauri is a result of contacts between the steppe nomads who came to the Crimea in the 4th century BC, who lost their ethnic characteristic already in the 3rd century BC. The most striking of which is the ornamentation of ceramics and stopped burying in the stone schist of their tribal cemeteries, like this. This is typical Taurian or Kyzyl-Koba cemetery. But this burial is not typical for Taurian tribes because it has a burial mound. Mention in the text of Roman authors of Taurian Scythians or Scythian Taurians probably belong to this ethnic group of the Crimea. Another version of ethnic origin of the East Crimean foothill group of Crimean barbarians is proposed by Krapunov. He believes that about the 5th century BC, a group of Taurian people crossed the steppe and settled near the coast of the Sea of Azov in the Kerch Peninsula. He argues for Taurian burials surrounded by cromlechs. It have no cromlech. On the coast of Azov, dating from the 5th to the 1st centuries BC. In the second, 1st centuries BC, Krapunov sees them returning to the foothills, and here this explains the appearance of these burials there. In our opinion, the resettlement of the 5th century BC originated not from the foothills of Crimea, but from the territory of the ancient Bosporus, where such a funeral custom has deep roots. As discussed above, the appearance of this population in the Crimea in the 2nd, 1st centuries BC is associated with the next stage of the history of Crimea, represented by the advancement of Sarmatians and then in some centuries Gothic-Line Union. Assimilation of the Tauri by the Scythian tribes who came to the Crimea in the 4th century BC took place during the second half of the 4th, 3rd centuries BC and is marked by the evanescence of ornamentation of Kyzyl-Koba pottery and the cessation of the functioning of the classic Taurian row cemeteries of stone schist. Those, given the presence of two compact groups of finds dating from the beginning of the Taurian period of Kyzyl-Koba culture, this is the time of, this is 8th, 7th centuries BC, and its end about the 4th, 3rd centuries BC. It should be assumed that the burial in the Japallakh area appeared around the second half of the 8th, early 7th century BC in their first using. We described burial barrows with stone schist as the main grave in Yukharina Balka on the Herculean Peninsula and in the central foothills, where they have the same dating. And we have the same burial mound in Zolne Kurgan and in Lgovsky Kurgan. The second period of this use dates to the time of the marginalization of the Kyzyl-Koba ethnic component, Tauri, and the beginning of the formation of the late Scythian ethnic massif, which dates back to about 4th century BC. The burial custom of Tauri is changing at this time, and earlier burial barrows are reused, cleared of previous burials. Probably a stone pavement with funeral feast under the barrow, here it is, also belongs to this late period. As the late Kyzyl-Koba pottery of the East Crimean types, here is it. This is the jugs. This is 1, 2, 3 big jugs, and this is a pottery from the schist. Was found beneath it. The stone pavement, accompaniment, and the method of arrangement of the burial as a schist are typical for row cemeteries of the late stage of the Taurian period of the Kyzyl-Koba culture. But the burial mound is a new feature. The presence of traditional Taurian handmade pottery of East Crimean types in the Scythian burial barrows of the steppe in the 4th century BC suggests the existence of a certain Sarmatian tribe, Scythian tribe, which was in direct contact with the inhabitants of the central and eastern foothills of the Crimea. Here it is, this part. Such contacts could have created a new ethnic group that in the space of a few centuries formed the first barbaric state. Those continuing the general processes of the formation of early Hellenistic monarchies in the area of the Pontus, Exinus. The fact that The marginalization of the Tauri began with the transformation of the burial customs, indicates the primacy of changes in the ideological preferences of the Taurian ethnic component and changes in the region and cults all these population. It is also worth talking not about the transformation of funeral tradition, but about their complete change. Given the fact that the religion of the Tauri, according to the available sources proposed in recent studies, was quite primitive and based on the paradigm of Bronze Age ideology, a completely change is more likely than a transformation. In fact, little later, the ancient Roman authors use a new ethnonym, Taurian Scythians or Scythian Taurians, and maybe the sanctuaries which we know in the south coast of Crimea belongs to this population. And here is all of my reports, and thank you for your attention.